The encounter at the gallery. The warm sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the gallery, casting a soft glow across the sleek white walls, where contemporary art pieces were hung with an air of quiet sophistication. A clean, minimalistic space, the kind that whispered of exclusivity, wealth, and taste. It was the kind of gallery that drew attention from the elite and wealthy, those who saw art not just as beauty, but as an investment, a statement of status. This was exactly the kind of space James Carter had walked into, with a folder of his paintings tucked under his arm and a mixture of hope and quiet anticipation in his chest. James had been painting for years, but the world hadn't seen his work. The world hadn't seen him. As a black artist in an overwhelmingly white-dominated field, he was used to being overlooked, disregarded, or misunderstood. But the art he created wasn't born of the need for recognition. It was born from the depths of his soul, his identity, his struggle, and his triumphs. He had made a name for himself in niche circles, but for the world to truly see him, to see his art for what it was, he needed the right platform, the right person, the right opportunity. James had heard of Richard Stokes. The gallery owner's name was synonymous with exclusivity in the art world. He was a man known for his unyielding standards and even more notorious for his cold, calculating judgments. It was said that Stokes could make or break an artist's career with a single glance, and that reputation was the reason James chose this gallery. He didn't need the validation from the high-end collectors who frequented Stokes' gallery. What he needed was for someone, anyone, to see his art as more than just a product, to understand the story behind every stroke of paint. James had prepared himself for the meeting. His paintings, though abstract in style, spoke volumes. Each canvas held a narrative, a reflection of the culture, the struggles, and the beauty of being black in America. His art was infused with raw emotion, political undertones, and a deep connection to the history of the black experience. He knew this wasn't the kind of art most gallery owners were drawn to. But he believed that Richard Stokes, with his reputation for cutting-edge work, would understand. The gallery was empty when James arrived. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that filled the room, the floor shining under the bright lights. Richard Stokes was sitting behind a large, polished desk in the back, flipping through a stack of papers. James hesitated for a moment, taking in the elegance of the space, before stepping forward. "Excuse me," James said, his voice steady but laced with the nerves he refused to show. Richard looked up, his sharp eyes scanning James, a brief flicker of recognition passing over his face. James had prepared for this moment. But that didn't make it any easier. He'd always been seen as a stranger in spaces like these, a black man among the elite. "Can I help you?" Richard's tone was curt, already dismissive. "Yes," James replied, lifting the folder of his work. "I'm James Carter. I'm an artist, and I wanted to show you my portfolio. I believe my work might be a good fit for your gallery." Richard's gaze flicked to the folder, then back to James, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, giving James a once-over. There was a slight smirk on his face, as if he were evaluating the audacity of this unknown artist standing in front of him. "Is that so?" Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, what kind of art are we talking about here? Another one of those abstract expressions? Color splashes and chaotic lines?" James' brow furrowed slightly, but he refused to let the insult shake him. "Actually, my pieces explore the black experience, history, identity, resistance, beauty. They're more than just random splashes. They hold meaning." Richard chuckled, a low sound that held no warmth. "The black experience, huh? Let me guess, your paintings are important because they tell the same old story, right? Struggle, oppression, freedom, all that predictable nonsense?" James felt a flash of anger but forced himself to stay calm. He knew the drill. He had heard similar dismissals before, from gallery owners, critics, and even some peers in the art world who believed that black artists could only create works that conformed to stereotypes. But this time it stung deeper, because Richard Stokes was one of the elite. James had hoped for more than this. Struggle is a part of the story, James said, his voice calm but firm. But my work also celebrates resilience, culture, and our humanity. There's depth here, more than you might see at first glance. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He motioned toward the folder. Let me guess, you think these pieces are worth something, don't you? I believe they're valuable, James answered, his heart beating a little faster. Not just financially, but culturally. People will understand their worth once they see them in the right light. Richard leaned forward, eyes scanning the portfolio for a moment before speaking. Look, kid, I'm not here to be some art critic, and I'm certainly not going to put something up just because it has a message. You want to be in this business, you need to have something that appeals to collectors, people who can afford to spend millions. This, he gestured vaguely toward the folder, this looks like something that would be sold at a flea market. The insult cut deeper than James anticipated, but he refused to let it show. He had learned long ago that people like Richard would never see his work for what it truly was. You're wrong, James said, his voice steady. I can't change your mind, but these pieces are worth more than you can imagine. You'll see. One day, you'll see. Richard laughed, clearly entertained. Right. Well, maybe you should stick to whatever it is you're doing. This art world? It's not for everyone. Maybe try another gallery. We're not interested in something so niche. Without another word, Richard dismissed him with a wave of his hand. James stood there for a moment, a flash of frustration bubbling up inside him. But he swallowed it down, turning to leave. He didn't need Richard's approval. He walked out of the gallery, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The air outside felt fresher, more alive. He could feel the weight of the rejection, but also the flicker of resolve sparking in his chest. Richard Stokes hadn't seen it yet, but one day, James would make him see. This wasn't the first time James had encountered the closed doors of an art world that refused to recognize his worth. It wouldn't be the last. But as he stood on the busy street corner, a quiet determination took root in his heart. Richard Stokes had mocked him, but he wouldn't be the last person to do so. And someday, when his art was displayed in the very spaces Richard had deemed unworthy, the gallery owner would regret this moment. But James wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing it for himself, for his art, and for every other black artist who had been rejected and overlooked. They all deserved to be seen. The hidden truth. James' backstory. James Carter was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He wasn't the son of a prominent collector or a renowned art critic. He came from the rough edges of a working-class neighborhood, a place where survival often overshadowed dreams of creativity. His family, though loving, struggled to make ends meet. His father worked 2 jobs, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark, while his mother juggled shifts at a local diner to keep food on the table. Art was a luxury, not a necessity, and it wasn't something his parents had the time or resources to nurture. But somehow, art found James, and he, in turn, found solace in it. From a young age, James was drawn to colors, shapes, and textures in a way that felt like a lifeline. While his peers were out playing sports or hanging out at the park, he was hunched over scraps of paper, pencil in hand, sketching everything from the people he saw on the streets to the fleeting moments in his life that caught his attention. It was an escape. A way to make sense of a world that often felt harsh and unyielding. He learned to draw on anything he could find, old cardboard boxes, discarded paper, the margins of his textbooks. His mother, though busy, always encouraged him, recognizing his rare gift even if she didn't quite understand it. But James knew that being an artist, a black artist at that, wasn't a path to success in a world where only a select few had access to opportunities. It was a reality he could never ignore, no matter how many paintings he created in the solitude of his room. He'd seen how the art world operated, how it was dominated by the privileged elite, and how they valued certain kinds of art while dismissing others, often based on race, background, and class. But James didn't care. He painted not for fame, but because he needed to. He painted to express his experiences, his struggles, and his hope. It was cathartic. As he grew older, James sought out every resource he could find to hone his craft. He studied the masters, not in a formal classroom but through stolen moments in libraries, looking through books on famous artists. He apprenticed with local artisans who could teach him different techniques, gradually shaping his raw talent into something more polished. Over time, his art began to evolve. What started as simple sketches became sophisticated paintings that portrayed the rich history and cultural significance of his identity. Each brushstroke carried layers of meaning: the history of his people, the struggles of the marginalized, the complexities of being Black in America, all woven together in abstract yet deeply emotional forms. But even as his talent grew, James knew that for all his efforts, the mainstream art world would likely never take notice. So, he kept his art to himself, sharing it only with a few close friends and private collectors who understood its value. It was a secret he kept well, a quiet rebellion against the industry's refusal to acknowledge Black artists like himself. The hidden world of art auctions and underground galleries, though far removed from the glitzy, high society openings James had read about, was where his work began to find its place. He wasn't interested in fame, not yet. What mattered was the art, and in his quiet, unseen world, James found a small but growing group of people who saw it for what it truly was. James' success in secret. Unbeknownst to Richard Stokes, James had been making waves in the art world for years. His anonymity was both a choice and a necessity. The mainstream art scene was still largely hostile to the kind of work he produced. The industry's gatekeepers, many of whom held prejudices against Black artists, would never have embraced his pieces. But there was an underground market, a network of collectors and museums that were willing to overlook the superficial constraints of race and embrace the power of art itself. James' pieces had begun to attract the attention of private collectors, many of whom were intrigued by the mysterious artist who seemed to capture the Black experience in such profound ways. Auctions featuring his work had seen bids soar into the millions, though James' name was never revealed. Buyers were enamored with the emotional depth of his paintings, the raw energy that pulsed through the strokes of his brush. They marveled at the way his art seemed to transcend the boundaries of race and culture, telling stories that were both deeply personal and universally human. While these collectors had no idea who James was, they knew that they were bidding on something that had tremendous value, a value that went beyond the market price. His pieces often sold for astronomical amounts, and though his identity remained a mystery, the art world had started to take notice. Museums began to quietly inquire about the artist behind the works. The name James Carter began circulating among the elite collectors, but no one could find him. It was as though he existed in a space between worlds, his art coveted, but the man behind it, a shadow. James continued to work in the background, keeping his identity secret. He had no desire to be the subject of a media frenzy, no interest in becoming the next big thing. For now, he was content with knowing that his art was being seen, even if only behind closed doors. But his works were steadily becoming more valuable, and the whispers about this mysterious artist were growing louder. The revelation. One evening, after a particularly successful auction, James sat in his modest apartment, reviewing the contracts and invoices that accompanied the sale of his latest collection. The numbers were staggering, over $20 million for just 5 pieces. His work was now in the hands of some of the wealthiest people in the world, yet they still didn't know who he was. The irony wasn't lost on him. James knew that the art world, with all its prestige and power, had no idea what it had been missing. The institutions and galleries that prided themselves on being at the forefront of contemporary art had all ignored him. Yet his works were fetching millions. Museums clamored to add his pieces to their collections, and wealthy patrons were willing to pay whatever it took to get their hands on his next piece. The very institutions that had once rejected him were now desperately trying to discover the man behind the paintings. It was the kind of twisted reality that James had come to expect. The art world was just like any other elitist domain, it had a habit of only recognizing worth when it was made apparent through wealth and power. James had always known this, and it was why he had chosen to stay hidden. But as the demands for his work grew louder, James felt a stirring inside him, a call to finally step into the light and show the world who he truly was. Contrast of worlds. The contrast between the art world's perception of James and the reality of his success was striking. To the public eye, James Carter was just another struggling artist, lost in the crowded sea of hopefuls, trying to make a name for themselves. But in the shadows, he was a powerhouse, his art a commodity that people would kill to own. Meanwhile, the art world continued to operate as though nothing had changed. It remained a space for the rich and privileged, where race and class played significant roles in determining who got recognition and who didn't. Black artists like James were still seen as outsiders, their works dismissed as niche or too radical by many in the upper echelons of the industry. The systemic racism in the art world was both blatant and subtle, a bias that permeated every level, from gallery owners like Richard Stokes to critics and curators who believed that art created by people of color could only be appreciated within the narrow confines of cultural stereotypes. James had come to terms with this reality long ago, but it didn't make it any easier to navigate. His success in the underground world was a bittersweet triumph. It felt hollow, like a victory that wasn't fully his. He was constantly forced to move between two worlds, the one where his art was valued, and the one that refused to acknowledge his worth. James' reaction. As James reflected on his journey, he felt both a sense of accomplishment and frustration. He had spent years honing his craft, pouring his soul into every painting. And now, his art was being recognized, but not for the reasons he had hoped. It wasn't because the art world had finally come to understand its value. It was because his work had become a commodity, something to be bought and sold for its market worth. The systemic discrimination in the art world was still alive and well, and James was tired of playing the game. He had spent years working in the shadows, allowing his art to speak for itself. But now, it was time for him to step into the light. He wasn't just an artist, he was a force, one that the art world had no choice but to reckon with. And if Richard Stokes and others like him were too blind to see that, then James would make them see, on his own terms. With this resolve, James began to plan his next move, knowing that the time for being overlooked was over. The world was about to see the truth, and James Carter was ready to show them what he was truly capable of. The big break. James' plan. James Carter had always known that the art world didn't work in simple terms. It wasn't just about creating something beautiful or meaningful, it was about creating something that could be seen and recognized by the right people. Richard Stokes had made it clear that he wasn't interested in the kind of work James created, work that was deep, personal, and rich with history. But Richard's dismissal had only lit a fire inside James. If the industry didn't want to take him seriously, James would make them. He didn't need their validation, but he wanted them to acknowledge his worth, in a way they couldn't ignore. Rather than allowing the rejection to fester into bitterness or anger, James decided to use the very system that had rejected him to his advantage. If Richard Stokes wasn't going to value his art, then James would make sure someone else did. He had a plan, a calculated move that would expose Richard's ignorance while also propelling James into the limelight he deserved. It wasn't about revenge, it was about making a statement. And in doing so, James would find a way to prove to the world that his work had undeniable value, beyond the limited view of those who thought they controlled the art world. His first step was reaching out to Margaret Quinn, a prominent art collector who had a reputation for championing overlooked and underrepresented Black artists. Quinn was known for her ability to spot raw talent in places where others wouldn't even look. She wasn't concerned with what was fashionable or trending, she cared about substance. She had been a quiet but powerful force in the art world, acquiring pieces from artists who had been rejected by the mainstream, artists like James. He'd heard of her before, and her reputation preceded her. If anyone could help him gain the recognition he deserved, it was Margaret. James sent her an email, carefully worded and deliberately mysterious. He didn't mention his name. Instead, he alluded to the fact that he had works that would interest her, works that would challenge the status quo of the art world. He included a few photos of his pieces, but left the details vague. Margaret, intrigued by the promise of something new and bold, responded quickly. She agreed to meet with him. James arranged for a secret exhibition, a small, private show, in a hidden venue. He invited only a select few, Margaret, a few influential art buyers, and a handful of curators who were known for their progressive views on art. No one knew who the artist behind the work was. The show was intentionally intimate, designed to make people feel like they were part of something exclusive, something rare. Margaret Quinn, in particular, was the key to James' plan. If she recognized the value of his work, the rest would follow. The exhibition. The night of the exhibition, the room was filled with anticipation. The lighting was soft but dramatic, casting shadows that made the vibrant colors of the paintings on the walls seem to glow. The pieces were powerful, abstract depictions of Black culture, moments of history captured in strokes of vibrant red, blue, and gold. There was a mix of emotional intensity and quiet reflection in every canvas, an unspoken story in every brushstroke. It was work that demanded attention. Margaret Quinn arrived at the venue, her sharp eye immediately drawn to the pieces on the walls. She moved through the gallery, pausing in front of each painting, taking her time. Her face remained stoic, but the gleam in her eyes said it all. She was impressed. These paintings were unlike anything she'd seen in a long time, full of emotional depth, cultural significance, and artistic mastery. Margaret had been around the art world long enough to know when something was truly special, and these pieces were beyond that. They weren't just special, they were transformative. She turned to the curator standing beside her, a man who was just as captivated by the works as she was. "Who is the artist?" she asked. The curator hesitated, glancing around the room. "We don't know yet. It's all under wraps for now. But the pieces are extraordinary, aren't they?" Margaret nodded. Extraordinary doesn't even begin to cover it. As the night went on, more buyers arrived, and the buzz in the room grew louder. Whispers of admiration spread from one person to the next. There were murmurs of recognition. People began to realize that these pieces were not just art, they were statements. The paintings resonated deeply with the guests, who found themselves drawn to their powerful depictions of history, resilience, and beauty. The work spoke to something deep within them, and for the first time in a long while, the room felt alive with the energy of something truly groundbreaking. Margaret, after taking in every piece, turned to the gallery's staff and asked to make an offer. She didn't know who the artist was, but she knew she wanted these paintings in her collection. Several pieces were purchased by her that evening, each of them fetching prices well beyond what anyone had expected. James had intentionally set the starting prices high, and Margaret, eager to secure the works for herself, happily obliged. The paintings, pieces that had been mocked and dismissed by people like Richard Stokes, were now worth millions. As the night wound down, the room was abuzz with excitement. People were eager to know the artist's identity, but no one had answers. The curator simply smiled and refused to reveal the details. The mystery surrounding the artist only added to the allure. James had orchestrated everything perfectly. The pieces were in the hands of someone who knew their value, and soon, the world would know, too. The twist. The night of the exhibition, the room was filled with anticipation. The lighting was soft but dramatic, casting shadows that made the vibrant colors of the paintings on the walls seem to glow. The pieces were powerful, abstract depictions of Black culture, moments of history captured in strokes of vibrant red, blue, and gold. There was a mix of emotional intensity and quiet reflection in every canvas, an unspoken story in every brushstroke. It was work that demanded attention. Margaret Quinn arrived at the venue, her sharp eye immediately drawn to the pieces on the walls. She moved through the gallery, pausing in front of each painting, taking her time. Her face remained stoic, but the gleam in her eyes said it all. She was impressed. These paintings were unlike anything she'd seen in a long time, full of emotional depth, cultural significance, and artistic mastery. Margaret had been around the art world long enough to know when something was truly special, and these pieces were beyond that. They weren't just special, they were transformative. She turned to the curator standing beside her, a man who was just as captivated by the works as she was. "Who is the artist?" she asked. The curator hesitated, glancing around the room. We don't know yet. It's all under wraps for now. But the pieces are extraordinary, aren't they? Margaret nodded. Extraordinary doesn't even begin to cover it. As the night went on, more buyers arrived, and the buzz in the room grew louder. Whispers of admiration spread from one person to the next. There were murmurs of recognition. People began to realize that these pieces were not just art, they were statements. The paintings resonated deeply with the guests, who found themselves drawn to their powerful depictions of history, resilience, and beauty. The work spoke to something deep within them, and for the first time in a long while, the room felt alive with the energy of something truly groundbreaking. Margaret, after taking in every piece, turned to the gallery staff and asked to make an offer. She didn't know who the artist was, but she knew she wanted these paintings in her collection. Several pieces were purchased by her that evening, each of them fetching prices well beyond what anyone had expected. James had intentionally set the starting prices high, and Margaret, eager to secure the works for herself, happily obliged. The paintings, pieces that had been mocked and dismissed by people like Richard Stokes, were now worth millions. As the night wound down, the room was abuzz with excitement. People were eager to know the artist's identity, but no one had answers. The curator simply smiled and refused to reveal the details. The mystery surrounding the artist only added to the allure. James had orchestrated everything perfectly. The pieces were in the hands of someone who knew their value, and soon, the world would know, too. The twist. The confrontation. James' public reveal. The time had finally come. James Carter had spent years hiding in the shadows of the art world, his work thriving in the underground market while the mainstream art industry refused to recognize his talent. But now, with his name gaining momentum and his work valued in the millions, he was ready to take his place in the spotlight. James had been invited to attend a major art event, an exclusive gala held by one of the most prestigious art institutions in the world. It was the kind of event where the elite gathered, wealthy collectors, curators from renowned museums, art critics, and gallery owners who prided themselves on their taste and influence. The event was meant to celebrate emerging artists, and while James was one of the invited guests, no one knew he was the artist who had been making waves with his anonymous works. This was his moment, a chance to be seen, not as a shadowy figure, but as the powerful force in the art world that he had always been. As James entered the grand hall, he couldn't help but notice the glances directed his way. People were intrigued by his presence, though they still didn't know who he was. He'd taken great care to keep his identity hidden, but tonight, he was going to change that. The evening began with speeches and introductions, a sea of well-dressed individuals moving gracefully between the exhibits. James, as a guest of honor, was seated at a table near the front, but he was far from being a passive observer. He had one purpose tonight, to make sure everyone in the room knew who he was. As the speeches continued, James stood up and made his way toward the stage, carrying one of his most significant pieces under his arm. The room fell silent as he approached, and all eyes turned to him. The host, a well-known curator, paused in confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a special announcement tonight," the host said, his voice thick with surprise. "It appears one of our guests has a special presentation to make." The crowd murmured in curiosity as James stepped up to the microphone, setting the canvas down behind him. He had prepared for this moment, and he knew what was about to happen would shake the art world to its core. The audience leaned forward in anticipation, unaware of the bombshell that was about to drop. "Good evening," James began, his voice steady but commanding. "I'm James Carter, and this is my art." A hush fell over the room. The gallery owners, critics, and collectors who had admired his anonymous work at auctions and private viewings stared at him in disbelief. The realization hit them all at once: the works they had been fawning over, the paintings that had fetched millions, were the creations of the man standing before them. The following morning, as news of the secret exhibition spread, James made sure to leave a subtle message for Richard Stokes. He took a piece of paper, carefully folded it, and placed it in the mailbox outside the gallery. On it, he wrote a single sentence: the artist you've been dismissing is now the buyer you'll want to impress." Richard had no idea what to make of the message when it arrived. He'd been following the buzz surrounding the anonymous artist whose work had been displayed in secret, but he hadn't connected the dots. As the owner of a gallery that had seen many trends come and go, Richard felt secure in his position. He had always prided himself on his discerning eye, but now, his gallery was losing its exclusivity. Other galleries, smaller but more progressive, were gaining traction. People were beginning to talk about the mysterious artist whose works had recently fetched astronomical sums. Richard couldn't ignore it, the paintings were everywhere now. They were being displayed in private collections and included in high-profile auctions. The art world, it seemed, had been waiting for something like this. And yet, despite the increasing demand for these works, Richard was still too proud to admit that he had been wrong. He hadn't seen the potential in James Carter's art. And now, as the value of those pieces skyrocketed, Richard was left behind, unable to grasp the magnitude of what he had missed. Frustration gnawed at Richard as he watched his business slowly falter. He could no longer ignore the fact that the artist he had dismissed was now a force in the art world. But the stubbornness that had defined Richard's career prevented him from accepting his mistake. Instead of looking inward, he blamed the market for changing, convinced that the art world was simply fickle. He couldn't bring himself to admit that it was his own ignorance, his refusal to see the worth of James' work, that had caused him to miss out on one of the most important artists of his generation. And all the while, James, with his quiet confidence, watched from the sidelines, knowing that his moment had come. He wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else define his worth again. The art world would have to reckon with his talent, and James Carter was prepared to take his place at the forefront, whether they were ready for him or not. Whispers rippled through the room. James had been the elusive artist they had been trying to track down. The pieces they had eagerly snapped up, the paintings that had shocked the art world, were his. The very same artist Richard Stokes had dismissed as unworthy. James allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "You've seen my work. You've marveled at it, you bid on it, and now you know who I am. I'm the artist who was ignored by this very industry for far too long. I'm the artist you all failed to see, and yet, I stand before you today, as a testament to what happens when the system fails to recognize true talent." A wave of realization washed over the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others looked to one another in disbelief. But in that moment, James had made it clear, he was no longer invisible. The art world would have to reckon with his presence, his work, and his success. Richard's shock. In the back of the room, Richard Stokes stood frozen, his face a mask of shock. He had heard the rumors, of course, whispers of an anonymous artist whose work had been selling for astronomical prices, whose name had become a coveted secret in the art world. But he had never imagined that the artist would be standing right in front of him, presenting himself as boldly as James Carter was now. Richard's heart raced as he watched the events unfold. The realization hit him hard, the man he had mocked and dismissed as a nobody was the very artist who had been shaking the art world to its core. The pieces he had rejected, the works he had so callously brushed aside, were now worth millions, and the artist responsible for them was standing right before him, claiming the spotlight that Richard had once reserved for himself. For a moment, Richard tried to maintain his composure, his professional facade, but it was clear that the weight of his mistake was sinking in. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his judgment, and now he was facing the crushing reality of his ignorance. He had underestimated James, not just as an artist, but as a person. And in doing so, he had missed an opportunity that could have made his gallery one of the most talked about in the world. A tense conversation. After the event, as the crowd began to disperse, Richard made his way toward James. He had to speak to him, had to somehow explain the inexplicable, apologize for his blatant mistake. But as he approached James, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. "James," Richard said, his voice tight, trying to sound professional, though it was clear he was struggling to maintain control. I didn't realize it was you. I have to admit, I made a terrible mistake." James looked at him, his expression calm but sharp. He had known this moment would come, and he wasn't about to let Richard off the hook so easily. You did, James said, his voice even. But you weren't the only one. The art world has spent decades undervaluing black artists. It's not just you. You're a part of a system that actively ignores talent because it doesn't fit a certain mold. Your mistake wasn't just personal, it was part of something much bigger. Richard flinched at the sharpness in James' words, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. His mind raced, trying to come up with a response, something that would repair the damage he had done. James, I never meant to disrespect you. I see now that your work is extraordinary. I was wrong. James didn't flinch. You're right. You were wrong. But that's not the point. The point is that I don't need your validation anymore. And I don't need this system that's built to keep people like me out. I'm beyond that now. Richard's face reddened with embarrassment. He knew that James was right, but the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Please, I'm sorry, he said, his voice shaky. I was foolish, and I didn't understand. Can we make this right? James shook his head, his gaze unwavering. The best way for you to make it right is to recognize that I'm not some anomaly. I'm here to stay. And I'll continue to make art that challenges everything this industry stands for. The best revenge? It's success. And that's exactly what I have now. James' response. James didn't offer Richard the satisfaction of seeing his anger or hurt. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence that had been building inside him for years. He had no need for revenge, no desire to gloat over his success. His art, and his success, spoke for itself. You can apologize all you want, Richard. But the damage is done. You missed your chance, James said, his voice calm but firm. I don't need your apology. What I need is for the art world to recognize that people like me, artists of color, have always had something to offer. The only thing that changed is that I'm no longer willing to let the system dictate my worth. Richard stood there, stunned, as James turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. James wasn't looking back. He had already moved beyond Richard and the limitations of the industry that had rejected him for so long.